It's The World This Week, The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from New York, Noor Ibrahim, Daily Beast Deputy World Editor. How are you?
Very good, thanks. How are you?
I'm not so bad. It's been, I'm sure, a very quiet week for our Jerusalem correspondent, France 24's Iris Makler. How are things, Iris?
I'm hanging in here.
Okay. It's not over yet, so keep some in the tank. Reporter Rosie Kalir is with us as well. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
All right. And France 24's very own Philip Turl.
Hello, Francois.
Welcome back.
And in reply to your question, I think I'm okay.
You think you're okay. All right. We'll see after The World This Week. The World This Week, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, #World This Week. It's been a quarter century, 25 years since Benjamin Netanyahu was first prime minister of Israel. The Likud leader has since honed his skills as the ultimate political survivor. This time, though, has Bibi met his match with an unlikely trio. His hardline former chief of staff, Naftali Bennett, TV presenter-turned-centrist opposition leader Yair Lapid, and Islamist Arab-Israeli politician Mansour Abbas. This picture taken just less than an hour before Wednesday's deadline, and the call went out to Israel's president.
Mr. President, I'm calling you to say that I have succeeded in forming a government with factions of Yesh Atid, Yamina, Kehol Lavan, Ram, New Hope, Meretz, and the Labour Party.
That's a lot of names there, Iris Makler.
It's a lot of names, and it's a patchwork going across all the parts of Israeli politics, actually, from the hard right, ultra-nationalist, the man who is mooted to be the prime minister, all the way through centrist parties to the left and to an Arab party, an Islamist Arab party, for the first time in Israel's political history. So you could either call it something that, you know, is a camel, a horse designed by a committee, it's a camel, or you could say this is actually a unity government fighting for democracy and trying to end the 12-year, more than 12-year now stint, continuous rule of Benjamin Netanyahu. So you can look at it both ways or either way, you know, for the good of the public. For Netanyahu's good maybe too, that's what its aim is.
Yeah, and when there was that the white smoke, if you will, that came just before the deadline Wednesday evening, did you know then that this was far from over?
Yes, well, I knew because I was listening to Israeli analysts, and I wasn't sure if it was because they were so hypnotized by Benjamin Netanyahu, who is so dominant and dominating here. I thought, wow, they can't even say that he's gone. It was all these sporting slogans, it ain't over till it's over, it ain't over till the fat lady sings, you know, he hasn't gone yet. And we have seen that during this week, you know, he cannot form a government himself. So now it's dirty tricks week. It's where he is targeting the weakest links in that motley crew opposed to him. That's the right-wing parties. You know, there are demonstrators outside the homes of the people whom they regard as wavering. There are death threats to them. There are huge protests against them on social media. Their rabbis call them and tell them not to do it. Their friends call them and tell them not to do it. People call them traitors. So, you know, that's one way to try and at the very last minute, when you can't form a government, make sure the other guy can't either.
If you thought Netanyahu would throw in the towel, just check his Twitter feed where he claimed on Thursday that, quote, Bennett sold the Negev to Ram. That's the party of Mansour Abbas. All right-wing Knesset members must oppose this dangerous left-wing government. And as Iris was just describing, Likud supporters Thursday evening staging a rally, one outside the home of former Justice Minister Ayelet Shaked. She's a hardliner with Bennett's party. There were some, Noor Ibrahim, even talking that there might be a January 6th moment, a reference to what happened at the Capitol. Your thoughts on this showdown, which has yet to finish playing out?
I think the natural instinct after hearing that Netanyahu is out is to celebrate and to think that it's done. But if you look a little closer, I mean, he's had so many instances where he's been so close, and we've even written about it, where it's like, is it finally coming? Was he going to be ousted right after the March election? But I think it's completely understandable, and it has echoes of Donald Trump too, where people are saying, unless he's physically leaving office, I won't believe it until I see it.
Won't believe it until you see it, and. Are you surprised at what we're seeing in terms of the fact that there's this pressure being put on members of parliament?
No, I'm not. I mean, it's been over a decade of this man doing everything he can to hold on to power, and he's done everything from put his cronies in top government positions. He ordered the closure of the Israeli parliament. So I think that it's very natural to finally want this to be done. And it seems like it's this never-ending cycle with him. But I think there definitely is a light at the tunnel here, and this is the most serious threat that he's facing in a very long time.
Philip Charles, this kind of reminds us of a few years back, Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. We kept saying, this time he's gone. This time he's gone. And it took forever for it to actually happen.
Well, I don't think Benjamin Netanyahu has gone. And I was just thinking that the very first time I went to Israel and the West Bank was in 1996, when he first became prime minister. And I was talking to an elderly Palestinian owner of a hotel, and he was saying to me at the time, we don't have anything to worry about because Benjamin Netanyahu is not eternal. He's not going to be here forever. Well, here we are, like all these years later, and he's still there. And it doesn't really look as though he's got any plans to do anything else. And we'll fight tooth and nail. And I think we're in for a very difficult period because not only is Benjamin Netanyahu completely determined to hold on to power, he will do everything, as you were just saying, to try to upset the apple cart as far as the new government.
Because it's personal, because of the fact that he's got this corruption trial.
I was going to come to that in a moment. But he knows that they are just surviving on like a shoestring of support, and at any moment the whole thing could just collapse when disagreements start coming between the different parties within the government. How on earth can you agree on anything when you go from the far right to the far left? It's just going to be virtually impossible. So I think he's banking on that. And the question that I don't have an answer to, and I'm often wondered, is what is motivating not only Benjamin Netanyahu, but Donald Trump and all sorts of people who are very determined to cling on to power? Is it because you think that you're on a mission? You think that this actually, the country, the job, you own it, therefore it's yours forever? Or in the case of Benjamin Netanyahu, is there also a very personal reason in it because he knows that he's going to be in serious trouble if he doesn't carry on being prime minister and faces court proceedings, which he's already facing at the moment, possibly large fines, maybe even more than that. And he wants to cling on to power to change the judicial system so that he can avoid going to prison or having some very difficult and embarrassing things to have to own up to afterwards. So I think all of those are reasons that he's going to try to cling on to power. But, we're in a situation now where hold on to your seats. The mud is about to start being slung around the Knesset and also, I think, more generally in Israel between those for and against Benjamin Netanyahu. And this coalition, unfortunately, doesn't look strong enough to be able to fight that off very easily.
Rosie Clear?
But I think doesn't the final decision as to whether Netanyahu would be pardoned or the prosecution would continue, doesn't that come down to the president in
and
Israel?
the new one's just been
elected?
And
the new one's just, and I think that's one of the most interesting stories to come out of Israel this week that hasn't really been spoken about is the presidential election and between Herzog and then Miriam Peretz, two very, very different figures. But in the end, it was Herzog who's won, and he's a kind of older statesman, and it's not really clear whether he's pro or anti Netanyahu. So that's yet a new chapter that we've got to look forward to in Israeli politics in the coming weeks or months.
Yeah, before we get to whether or not he's pardoned, again, there still has to be that vote of confidence. We showed earlier those images outside the home of one Yamina party member. Another potential soft target is a lawmaker by the name of Nir Orbach. He's had demonstrators under his window Thursday evening. And if you didn't know who Nir Orbach was before the week began, well, neither did many Israelis, apparently. Writing in Yediot Aharonot, columnist Sima Kadmon asked aloud, "Are we destined every week to meet a Yamina member who was anonymous until the election and upon whom the country's fate now quite literally depends?" Is that an overstatement, Iris?
No, because no one did know who Nir Orbach was. He's basically another religious party apparatchik moving around. The party's changed a bit. So no one did know him. And then he voted against, there was a motion to change the speaker ahead of the vote from the one who is loyal to Netanyahu to the Coalition for Change's speaker. And he voted against that. And everybody's looking and saying, who's this guy? I do want to say one other thing. It's not just Nir Orbach. I just heard today that the Israeli police are allowing a march, which they didn't allow 2, 3, 4 weeks ago on Jerusalem Day, which was the beginning of the Gaza war as well. So that was a march of religious Jews through the old city of Jerusalem. I just find that timing extraordinary. That's going to happen on Thursday before the new government is sworn in. So I think there are other pitfalls that could stir someone like Nir Orbach, now that we know who he is, to once again feel that he can't be in this government with an Islamist party. So I think there are pitfalls along the way, and that this 10-day period, because it will be 10 days from the acknowledgement of the new government on the vote of confidence the Monday after, many things can happen in that time.
All right, and just one more player who's important in all of this is, again, Mansour Abbas, an Arab Israeli, an Islamist. He's only got 4 seats to his party's name. Yet he is the man who is being coveted. He says our project is not Netanyahu's project. It's the project of Arab society, its rights, status, and problems wanting to be solved. This is a completely different logic from the nonsense made by some political parties. Noor Ibrahim, when you're just come out of the worst fighting in years between Palestinians and Jews, particularly the fighting between Israel and Gaza, when you saw that sparked the worst tension in decades in communities that are mixed, Arab, Israeli, and Jewish. Your thoughts on Mansour Abbas taking the line that, hey, I'm just being pragmatic, is that the right way to go?
Look, I mean, I think it's very clear that the one thread, the one common denominator between these politicians is this desire to oust Netanyahu. But I'll tell you what, we've spoken to Palestinians on the ground and in Gaza, and they're not celebrating this, especially when you look at the history of the would-be replacement prime minister for the first 2 years, Naftali Bennett. He's had his own fair share of controversies, including allegedly boasting about killing lots of Arabs. So, no, they're definitely not celebrating. Many of them are saying there just won't be a big difference here. And yes, it is a very diverse coalition, and Bennett won't necessarily have free rein to do whatever he wants, but it's not really a cause for celebration at this moment, especially amongst the
even though, again,
population.
this will be unprecedented, seeing Arab Israelis in government in Israel.
Absolutely. And that just isn't causing much excitement. At least that's what we're hearing and what our correspondents have been hearing as well, that it won't translate into legitimate change for people.
I think Noor is correct in what she's saying. I'm not expecting anything to really change. And even reading today that the whole thing that blew up this war against Hamas in Gaza between the Israeli, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, was this eviction or upcoming eviction of Palestinians from East Jerusalem. It looks like that could probably go ahead anyway. There's not going to be any change coming along anytime soon where that's going to stop. And if you've got someone like Naftali Bennett, who is in charge of the country as prime minister, he's about as hardline as you can possibly get over the next 2 years. If he actually manages to survive that long, it's not going to be much of a change, if not even harder, I think, than Benjamin Netanyahu. So there is reason for the Palestinians not to be celebrating too soon. And I don't think anybody's uncorking the champagne right now because nobody really knows what's going to happen in the next few days.
One final question. Iris Makler, Yair Lapid, it was his coalition to form. He hands the mantle to Naftali Bennett, this hardline nationalist, to be the prime minister first. Has he been played, or is that a masterstroke?
It's being regarded here as a masterstroke. He had a ceiling of about 20 votes. He got 17 this time, 19 once before. And the polls show him, really, really rising by about 25 to 30%. So it is appreciated. It's appreciated that he did this negotiation so coolly and so with such determination. It's appreciated that he's stepping aside to let the balance of power guy come in, even though he doesn't really deserve it. With only 6 votes, it was 7, it's now 6, it may be 5 if Nir Orbach, now that we know who he is, if Nir Orbach leaves as well. So he's giving a gift on a plate to Naftali Bennett, and he's doing it because he says he wants good governance, and he is getting a reward from the public, because now when they do comparative who will be the best prime minister, it was always Netanyahu far out in front. And now he's not so far ahead of Yair Lapid, actually.
All right. We shall see how this unfolds ahead of that vote of confidence. A lot can happen. A lot's going to happen when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. From New York City, Noor Ibrahim, Daily Beast Deputy World Editor, is with us. From Jerusalem, France 24 correspondent Iris Makler. Reporter Iris Makler is with us from Jerusalem. Reporter Rosie Kalir is with us here, documentary filmmaker. And France 24's very own Philip Turl. It's spring here in Paris, which means it's time for tennis. And the French Open tournament is back with fans. But one event upstaged it all. And a question: what are the rights and obligations when you're the highest paid female athlete in the world? The tennis world split when world number 2 Naomi Osaka announced she would skip post-match press conferences at this year's Grand Slam tournament. But when she pulled out completely, she told fans that actually it was because of self-care, that she was been suffering from bouts of depression and anxiety since 2018. Rosie Kalir, what was your reaction to this story when it first broke?
Initially, I think like a lot of people here in France just felt that because she is the highest paid player, then that she has an obligation, as you said in your introduction, to talk to the media. It's just part of being a sports person. And I think then sympathies set in with her because of her second statement. So the first statement just said that she was not going to take part in press conferences, but then the second statement that came a couple of days later, pointed directly to the fact that she's suffering from depression. And then I think the narrative completely changed. Even her, major sponsor, Nike, other sponsors, who make up a large part of her revenue, came out in support of her. So I think there was this miscommunication a little bit on her part, just sort of saying that she's not going to speak to the media. And I think for some people that resonated a little bit with Meghan Markle and Harry, obviously in the UK, that they're trying to control the kind of media narrative around them, and that got journalists' backs up, I think, the wrong way. But as I say, once the second statement came out saying, that she is suffering from a mental illness ultimately, then I see that the people's attitudes towards her, both here in France and on social media around the world, have changed, and there was empathy for her.
People's attitudes changed, and tennis is a sport that says that those post-match press conferences, the visibility it gives the sport is what makes it a success. As Rosie said, we didn't have the full picture when the week began.
Well, you know what, Francois? I feel tempted to say the following. Just let her get on and play tennis and forget about the press conferences, because she's an athlete. You know, she's not a politician. She's not someone who's media savvy. She's not a journalist like you and me. She's not used to speaking in front of the cameras and probably doesn't like speaking in front of vast amounts of people. It's a really intimidating, difficult thing to do. And I have a lot of respect for athletes who are forced to do it. It's not a choice. You have to go and do it. You know, for years I did the Tour de France, and after every stage, the riders have to come, the yellow jersey rider and the winner of the stage have to come and do a press conference, whether they like it or not, and whether they're exhausted or not. They have to come, and they're opposite all these journalists who ask all these questions. Some of them are good, well thought out questions. Others are quite stupid, but they have to answer. And I understand it's a very difficult and intimidating thing to do. So let her play the game. Let the public see her play the game. Let her win the tournament, and we'll all be delighted for her. And leave the poor girl alone. If she's suffering from depression and she's suffering from anxiety, then she should be allowed not to attend this press conference. What the bottom line here is that I think that the authorities are worried about is if they let her get away with it, Naomi Osaka, then others are going to say, well, I don't want to do it either, and all their press conference, their daily press conference, will no longer take place, or only a few people who want to do it will agree to take part in these press conferences. And I think that is the underlying fear amongst the organisers. There's not much in there which I think is based on, well, what's this poor person thinking about, and do they have a problem with talking in public?
But they do. But she has changed the conversation, Iris Mockler, because we've heard the heads of the Grand Slam tournaments who've come out after her statement and recognized that, they're going to sit down and think of ways to address the mental strain that these top-level athletes face, something they said they hadn't done before.
You know, during all this story, I went back and watched her winning the Open, the US Open, standing next to Serena Williams, the whole crowd booing her. She was in tears. You know, she's pulling her visor down over her eyes. I hadn't seen it before, and it's so affecting. And if you had anxiety anyhow, I can see how you wouldn't want to be talking in public after an experience like that, with Serena Williams having to put her arm around her to stop that crowd from tearing her apart. So I can see her mental health issues. And it's also quite interesting, you know, you have to speak to the public, that's required, but you can't speak about anything political. That's not allowed. So you can't take the knee and you can't talk about Black Lives Matter. You can only speak about what you're allowed to speak about. And this young woman doesn't want to do that. And I respect that. And I think she has changed the conversation, and I think for the better. And I think Philip Turl is right. They're not worried about her necessarily. They're worried about everybody turning it on its head, especially now that if you're on Twitter, you don't need to go. You can still communicate with your fans. You don't need the press conference. The press conference and Roland Garros and the matches need you.
Yeah, and you mentioned that 2018 U.S. Open final. At the time, Naomi Osaka is 20 years old, her first Grand Slam win. As you said, Serena, after having that confrontation with the chair umpire, was furious. There was booing during the awards ceremony. This time, 3 years later, Serena once again fully behind Naomi Osaka.
I feel for Naomi. I feel like I wish I could give her a hug because I know what it's like. Like I said, I've been in those positions. We have different personalities, and people are different. Not everyone is the same. I'm thick, other people are thin. So everyone is different and everyone handles things differently.
Everyone handles things differently. Noor Ibrahim, Naomi Osaka is a star. And that's the other perhaps added layer of pressure that's upon her. She has spoken out on issues like Black Lives Matter.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it really speaks to the generational divide that we're seeing with these younger athletes. And I also think it's time to recognize that, we have a lot of conversations about destigmatizing mental health issues and talking about those things and having open conversations about it. But the fact is it needs to translate to action sometimes. And that requires certain compromises and sacrifices. So it's about not just, talking the talk and actually realizing that you have to walk it as well. And like I said, I don't think that she needs it either. We mentioned the Twitter thing, but it used to be that these press conferences were so necessary for athletes to remain relevant, for them to maintain their fan bases too. But at this point, I think people are paying a lot more attention to their social media pages and connecting that way. So yeah, I just don't think, I think if you're invested in the athlete, if they inspire you, then this shouldn't be something that really bothers you.
Rosie Clear?
Yeah, I thought also what was interesting about her second statement, Francois, is that, she spoke about really wanting to help others, clearly suffering from depression. And that was a similar narrative that she took last year in the whole Black Lives Matter, if you remember, during her competition. She'd wear, masks with the names of, different victims of police violence in America. Although she, didn't speak out herself, powerfully on the matter. It was more symbolism for her, and I think that's a big part of her. She's young; she's still just 23 years old, I believe. But as she sort of develops an identity, develops her personality, then she's clearly wanting to sort of take the role of as a pioneer, but also as a helper and a voice for people who don't have the same stage that she has. So I think it's an interesting evolution that she's going through since just last year.
And she's going to have perhaps more pressure. I know that she has withdrawn from the first grass court tournament in Berlin ahead of Wimbledon in a couple of weeks' time. She might be carrying a nation's hopes during the Summer Olympics. Of course, it's a question of whether or not those Tokyo Summer Games still happen. I know Iris Mockler is alert to the fact that Australia's women's softball team is already there. They arrived this week. They're among the first to land in Japan. That is, again, if the games are still on. Organizers putting on a big show to celebrate 50 days until the opening ceremonies. That, though, Wednesday was overshadowed by news that 10,000 volunteers had quit.
At a time the country's medical system is already strained by the pandemic, who will take responsibility if infections spread further by holding the Olympics? The biggest reason I quit was the total disregard for human lives.
Iris, I've seen it read that the Japanese are now saying it'll be a disaster if they take place, these Olympics, because it's going to mobilize doctors, and it'll be a disaster if they don't.
I was reading about this, and I'm sort of mystified that only something like 3% of the Japanese population is vaccinated, because naturally you don't want to hold Olympics if only 3% of the population is vaccinated and they're having a fourth wave. It just seems counterintuitive to do that. I don't understand why such a low proportion is vaccinated. If you look to America and to Israel, the land of the miracle vaccine, it's as if there is no COVID here. But the one thing that everybody is fearful of is what's going to happen now when Israel reopens its airport. And there in Japan, they're bringing the whole world to them, all these athletes. And those poor volunteers, no wonder that they're quitting, because they're not being vaccinated. The vaccines are being offered to the athletes, but not to the volunteers. So I think it's actually a bit of a hot mess when I look at it from here. And I don't understand how they can possibly think they can hold this.
Japanese say that they are now ramping up the vaccination drive, that it is starting to increase. Noor Ibrahim, I saw the Daily Beast published a story a couple of weeks back saying that even the Yakuzas or the organized crime syndicates were against the Olympics. Why is that?
We spoke to, our correspondent spoke to a former big Yakuza boss, and even he was saying this is absolutely outrageous. But that's not surprising at all when you consider that I think the last poll I saw said that over 80% of the Japanese population is against this. They're shouting it from the rooftops. So what are you doing? This is not the time for this. So there's widespread opposition to this with everyone. Our correspondent also spoke to famous film directors. Basically, every public sphere is saying, this is a bad idea for us.
All right, so you have these sporting events where there's billions at stake. We saw it recently here in Europe, the Champions League final, when there was too much COVID in Turkey, moved to Portugal. Last week, it was Argentina forced to forego hosting the Copa America football tournament, which starts in 9 days' time. This week, the tournament wasn't canceled. It was moved to arch rivals Brazil, where new COVID infections are down, but still.
In the end, they decided not to go forward with it for health reasons and logical reasons. And now it seems like we're going to Brazil. Enough said.
Enough said. If you're Argentinian, it's got a sting having the Copa America in Brazil.
Well, it all sounds plausible, but I just don't see how they can just pick up the Tokyo Olympics and move it at such short notice to another city. If you think about all the preparation that is necessary to hold such a huge event, the world's biggest sporting event. And I think the Japanese are basically stuck between two choices, as you were saying at the start, which is, well, shall we go ahead and be criticised, or shall we not go ahead and also be criticised? But the bottom line here, Francois, is that if you look back to the last time they held the Olympics in 1964, that was their way of boosting Japan on the world scene, rebuilding the country after the Second World War. It brought in huge investments. So the financial stakes here are absolutely enormous. If the Tokyo Olympics are cancelled this time round, think of the insurance claim that is going to have to be lodged to get their money back for all the cancellation. It'll be the biggest insurance claim in the history of planet Earth, probably. So the financial impact of all of this is so enormous that I think the Japanese can't really go backwards. And it's not up to Japan to make the decision. It's up to the International Olympic Committee to say, we're going to pull the plug on this, we're not going to hold it. And just a word about the athletes. I mean, even the athletes that are going to this, who are risking all by going to Tokyo, have been training for years for this event. And to actually tell them, like, a month or so before it's going to happen, well, unfortunately, you can't go now, and all the training you've done is for nothing, that's also going to be a serious disappointment. So there are so many for and against factors here that it's just an absolutely impossible decision to take.
All right, before we go, we got to devote a little bit of time to a problem which is not going away. This time it's an Islamic school in Nigeria's north-central state of Niger. 136 pupils abducted by armed gunmen. It's just the latest in a spree of mass kidnappings that are following a familiar pattern: an attack, outrage, before negotiations.
The government hasn't made any effort, none at all.
I am pleading the government and the general public to help me, to help us, because I'm just a poor woman who has nothing.
So, Rosie Clear, there's two schools of thought. One is kidnappings for ransom have been going on for decades in Nigeria. Another is that this is on a whole new scale.
And it is on a whole new scale, particularly in the north of Nigeria, because you'll probably remember as a reporter in West Africa that, 10, 15 years ago, the kidnapping for ransom was happening in the south, the oil-producing south of the country, and it was, mainly targeting expatriates who were seen to be working for companies who could afford to pay. And I think what's different the past 6 months or so is, as I say, it's moved to the north. Whereas, we've seen mass kidnappings associated with Islamic fundamentalism in the northeast of the country, but it's spread way beyond that, and it isn't any more ideological in the north. It's about making millions of dollars. And the kidnappers, it was reported in the kidnapping that happened in Niger State in April that they demanded $16 million. So they're not even demanding ransom in local currency, but actually in hard dollars, and that they were given at least 10 million of that, apparently. So it really has become a business. And I think that, as the clip just showed there, is that there's a sense, I think, amongst people across the country that the government just isn't responsive enough to the pleas of parents, and why does it take the government so long to come out and denounce or condemn these things? And just it's taken them until today, because this kidnapping happened over 3 days ago. It's taken them until today just to come up with a figure of 136 who were actually kidnapped. So I think that that is probably one of the most painful things for people on the ground there at the moment, is a lack of government response to a degrading security situation.
Yeah, on Thursday, the state government in Niger State said it was negotiating with the gunmen who captured these pupils. You can see here on the map, it's not very far from the capital, in Tejina, all the while repeating the governor's claim in that state that no money would change hands.
Government is now in touch with some of the parents of the kidnapped children. They have been assured of the safe return of their wards. Let me reinstate our stance not to pay any form of ransom to any criminal like called bandits.
Not pay any form of ransom.
Well, I find that quite hard to believe, honestly, because I think if they're going to free up these school kids, quite often girls, they're not going to do it for no reason, because it's always in their interest to keep them as long as possible. And if you look at what Boko Haram did with the Chibok girls back in 2014, about 100 or so are still in captivity. So until the money changes hands, maybe not exactly what they want, then these releases are not going to take place. And coupled with that is, it's all fine to see these state governors talking, but quite often the state governors don't control what's going on in their own state. The security forces are demotivated, there's widespread corruption, and there's no investment. The key here, Francois, to stop this is investment in local areas, to give people a livelihood, to give people jobs, to give people money, to give people hope. That's completely absent. So what are they going to do? Let's look at what is like a walking safe on two legs. Kids, because kids are emotionally attached to their parents. They make the front pages of the headlines. In journalism, we were always told what was the thing that sold the best on the front page of a paper. Well, it's a story about a child. So if you can kidnap children, that is going to make the front pages of the paper. You're going to get talked about. You're going to get your cash. So let's go out there and do it. And until the government and the central government in Nigeria actually comes up with a plan, a viable working plan to work towards this financially and economically, then unfortunately I think this is going to carry on and maybe get even worse.
Yeah, abductions on the rise. We can show you the cover of the Daily Trust newspaper, which this Friday talked of the residents in the Abuja suburbs moving house to avoid kidnappings. And what was the work of Islamists in the Northeast has now spread, according to figures, but there you see the Daily Trust headline, has now spread. Figures by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, turning them into big business. Perhaps we can show that other graph there, because a few years back, most of those kidnappings were being committed by militants, jihadist militants, but as you can see, it's only the parts that are in orange, Rosie Kalir, that correspond to ideological militants doing any of the kidnapping. A lot of these are militias, bandits.
Yeah. Anyone who can afford an AK-47 and has no morals.
And to pick up on what Philip was saying here, if there's a general disintegration of the state, that means there's no silver bullet, is there, for solving this problem?
Yes and no. Actually, there is. So I would like to look at the solutions to problems, not just the problems. And one sort of novel solution that a state governor came up with, his name is Willie Obiano in Anambra State in the southeast of the country back in 2014, was to essentially have police, because he worked in collaboration with the police, that's essential, to have them demolish the houses of suspected kidnappers. And so this was back in 2014, and it did have an impact for several years in Anambra State. And one mustn't forget in Nigeria that state governors do hold probably the most power after the government. They have almost more power in their own state than the central government, more impact. So it's really a question, I think, not for 1 minute advocating that that's a solution.
And you were recently in the Northeast.
Yes,
Did you have a sense there that it was about ideology or was it about money?
Oh, it's about money. It's about money. And what's also not spoken about so much, because of course it's children who are being kidnapped, and that is awful and completely repugnant and unacceptable. But it's what doesn't get spoken about very much in the news is actually just the impact it has on pretty much everyone, and also the elites, that it's now considered out of the question, really dangerous to travel by road in Nigeria. And I have conversations with, officials, doctors, all different people from different stratas of society. And what you'll find, older people particularly will say today that they just cannot travel by road. You have to fly in Nigeria, and you certainly can't, be a tourist or to, travel to home to go see relatives. It's something that is become this phenomenon of kidnapping, whether it's mass kidnappings, but also just kidnap for ransom for money, is affecting the daily lives of pretty much everyone, including the elites, but perhaps except the government officials who can afford police escorts.
And afford to take those planes. Many thanks, Rosie Kalira. I want to thank as well Philip Turl. I want to thank Iris Mockler in Jerusalem, Noor Ibrahim in New York City, and thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.